Okay, well, I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight. I'm thrilled to see the size of the crowd. Apparently, you've seen my Facebook messages out there. I don't know. We have several board members here tonight. We're all very excited. This is the first program we've had in a while. We had one in January, and here it is the end of February, and we're back. So we have a few other programs coming up. We have one in March 10th at 1 p.m. It's a history show and tell, and we're inviting people to bring in their artifacts, their postcard collection, something they'd like to share with the rest of us. So depending on how many people show up for that program, we have to limit the amount of time. If you speak, we'll keep a handle on that. So that's on March 10th, and then April 14th is our annual business meeting and election. So that's a meeting for all the members of OBHS, and that would include any new members who would like to join. First, we'll have the business meeting, and then we'll have a talk by Bill Hogan about Brockton. And Brockton is celebrating an anniversary this year. It's their 150th anniversary of when they actually took on the name Brockton. Before that, they were North Bridgewater. So we have several challenges coming up that we'll be talking about at the annual meeting. One is there's always a need for volunteers. Another is financial, because everything's going up, inflation. Our building insurance just went up 20%, so we're struggling a little bit. And we also are looking for a treasurer. This is quite a challenge, because we have to have a treasurer on our board or we cease to exist. So if any of you are interested or know somebody who you think would be a good fit, somebody who maybe likes local history and also has a background in bookkeeping and knows QuickBooks, please send them our way. I could go on and on, but I don't think I should do that because Bill Hanna is here. He's ready to speak. He's been he worked in the 37 years in the Taunton School District, and he's retired from that, but he's still working at Bridgewater State University, part-time in the history department, right, Bill? And he writes and speaks frequently about New England history, and he has a new book, which has recently been published. He's co-authored it with Katie McDonald, and the book is called Ticket to the Sea. It's a history of the Taunton River. So anyway, Bill, you're up. Okay.
Thank you. It's nice to be here tonight, and it's especially nice to see some friends in the audience. Usually when we leave Taunton, we come out of our own territory, we enter the world of strangers. So this is nice to see so many of you. I'm here to talk about Camp MylesStandish, which in my generation and in my city, everybody knew about. It was simply, when I was a kid, it was simply referred to as the camp. And when they said that, everybody knew what it was. And I suspect that it was that way probably in Bridgewater as well. I'm going to talk to you about that tonight. I'll be glad to take questions about it after. I'll show you some pictures. It seems impossible for me to believe that that was 80 years ago. I'm involved with the Old Colony History Museum in Taunton. And years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and before, it was quite common to see people come to that museum from everywhere in the United States, and to say that they had been at Camp MylesStandish during the war. And they were coming back to see if there was anything that they remembered from that experience. And that's interesting because they died off eventually. And after that, their kids started to show up. And their kids were my age. And they would go and look for signs of what had once been the Camp MylesStandish. And now hardly anybody comes because in the third generation past, you know, that immediacy is gone. Anyway, I want to talk about that. Camp MylesStandish was built, amazingly enough, in 3 months. Let's put some of these pictures on here. See how it goes. Not too good, right? Okay, there we go. Any chance of dimming the lights?
Yes.
Would that affect the TV kids? So, in May of 1942, the war had been going on since December of 41. So we were 7 or 8 months into the war. And out of nowhere, sure, that's fine. Out of the blue, a notice comes to the city of Taunton saying that the War Department was about to build an army camp in North Taunton. And in order to do that, they would take 33 farms from North Taunton. That's a lot of territory. And 3 farms from over the line in Norton. So 36 altogether. And they were going to create an army camp that was going to be 1,620 acres. Now that's a big place. The people in Taunton, North Taunton, went nuts over that. Obviously they objected to it, even though there was a war on. And the congressman representing that district was Joseph Martin. Now some of you may remember the name of Joseph Martin, or be familiar with it. He was one of the most powerful men in the United States. He was a Republican congressman who served as Speaker of the House of Representatives in Washington. So they raised enough hell in North Taunton to get Joe Martin to come back to Taunton to meet with them. The place that he met with these farmers and others was the North Taunton Baptist Church, and I'll show you a picture of it in a minute maybe. It's still standing there. It's right almost to the entrance, it's almost to 495 on, well, you know where it is.
BJ's.
And they, yeah, right near BJ, across the street from BJ's. He met with them in that building, and the meeting took like 15 minutes. And his message to them was, I'm sorry, I feel bad for you, but there's nothing I can do. There's a war on, we're in it, and this is what's going to happen. They began that camp, constructing that camp, in June of 1942. They were finished in October. 35 miles of paved roads, 10 miles of railroad track, 1,500 buildings, an amphitheater with able to seat 16,000 soldiers, a hospital with 1,400 beds. This was a massive undertaking. Now remember, this is the end of the Great Depression, so there are all sorts of people who want work. They worked 3 shifts and they finished it. This building, none of us in this room will remember this building the way it looked now, the way it looked then. This was the Wampanoag Club. Wampanoag Club was built in 1912 as a roadhouse for the newly arrived automobiles, so that the few autos riding around would be able to go there, and that would be a restaurant. It's right on the shore of Watson Pond, if you know where I am in town. In Prohibition, it became a speakeasy run by Boston gangsters. Well, the War Department takes it by eminent domain, and they turn it into what becomes the administration building of Camp MylesStandish. That's the way it looked as a roadhouse. This is the way it looked as the administration building for the camp. After the war, this became Paul Dever School. And this became the administration building for Paul Dever School. That's the old wall. They called it the Wampin Tunnel. If I walked through the front door and I walked all the way through, I would come to the back door, which was on Watson Pond. This was only torn down just a few years ago. That's what it looked like. This is 2024. That's what it looked like in about 2020. Now it's gone. So, okay, Camp MylesStandish is built. It's done by October of 1942, and this is what it did. It was the chief staging area for the Boston port of embarkation. What does that mean? In the war, they had to prepare soldiers for the last-minute arrangements before they went overseas. There were 10 ports of embarkation in the United States. 6 of them were on the Atlantic coast. 2 were in the Gulf of Mexico, New Orleans being one, and 2 were on the Pacific coast, Los Angeles and San Francisco. The 6 along the Atlantic coast, one of the largest, the largest was New York. The second largest was Boston. And Camp MylesStandish was part of that Boston port of embarkation. Let me show you some pictures here. So what do they do here? Before a soldier was sent overseas, he had to go to a staging area. He could go to the staging area with his unit, and that's what happened most of all. There were a number of different regiments and army divisions which came through Camp MylesStandish. They came by train, and they came from all over the United States. They would arrive here. I'll show you a picture of the railroad depot. They came here, and the average stay for a soldier at Camp MylesStandish was 3 to 5 days. In the 3 to 5 days, this was the main gate. If I go up, if you know where I am, if I go up Bay Street right now, and I turn into what used to be Paul Dever School, there's a light, there's a traffic light there now, and across the way is Lake Sebastian, and there's a boat launch and so forth. But that entrance was right where the entrance to Paul Dever School was. If you go there today, there's still an entrance, but there's no indication ever of what that was. That was the main entrance. There were 2 other entrances as well. If you're familiar with Taunton, there was an entrance on Bassett Street, which is off Bay Street, and there was another entrance on Fremont Street, which is not far away. I think this is an interesting picture. This is a picture that's taken today. This is a modern shot. And you can see that the train tracks, the railroad tracks, this comes from Taunton. In the old days, they built a spur that came this way. Can you see where that was? And that was 10 miles of track. If you were a soldier arriving from anywhere in the United States, that's how you were going to get down there to the camp. Understand, okay? 1,500 buildings in this camp. Most of them were barracks. Tar paper. I'll show you a picture of them. Tar paper. 3 to 5 days. The population of Taunton in World War II was 43,000 people. The population of MylesStandish, Camp MylesStandish, on any given day was 37,000 people. Isn't that amazing? Most of those guys, many of those guys, had no idea where they were because they had come from all over the country. Understand, all right? This camp was 1,620 acres. Get it? MylesStandish? 1620? MylesStandish? Get it? That's the creativity of the War Department. But these guys, you can't tell from this picture, but they're either arriving or leaving the camp. So if I were a soldier and I was coming from, say, Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and I was going to come to Camp MylesStandish, here's what's going to happen to me. I'm going to get a complete physical. Every piece of equipment that I have is going to be checked. I'm going to get an eye test, an ear test. I'm going to see the dentist. They're going to check my feet once more to make sure that I don't have flat feet. And while I'm doing that, they're taking also every piece of equipment that has come with me. Everything. Trucks, guns, everything. And they're giving that the once-over as well to make sure that everything is ready to go. I would be there, as I said, and I would also have to sit through lectures, you know. I would have to maybe do some training. I'll show you some training. I think I have the pictures in here. Training, but nothing much. And I would be there for 5 days. If I am a kid, most of these guys are kids, right? The average age, I think, of a World War II soldier was 19, between 19 and 20. That's how old he was. Most of these guys had never been away from home, ever. They had no idea where Massachusetts was or Boston was or any of that. And they know, but they know where they're going to go. They're going to the European theater of war. That's what they know that. So they're going to take the opportunity in those 3 to 5 days to sample every one of the deadly sins that they can before they leave. What they want passes. They want passes to go to Boston. That's where everybody wants to go. If they can't go to Boston, they want to go to Providence. If they can't go to Boston or Providence, they want to go to Taunton. That's a whole other story. We don't have time for me to tell you about Camp MylesStandish in Taunton. What a great story that is. But anyway, they would go there. This was supposedly conducted, I say supposedly conducted, in top secret situations. When these guys arrived in camp, they were allowed to use the telephone. There were lines which were as long as, you know, you can imagine for these guys waiting to call home, because they called home, some of them, God love them, for the last time. They want their people, they can't say where they're from, they can't say where they're calling from. They can say that they are getting ready to be mobilized and to ship out. They can't tell their parents where they are, but it doesn't matter because everybody knows. The security was laughable. It was awful. I'll give you a good example. Kid arrives from Kansas with his group. Waits in line forever. Finally gets on the phone, calls his mother. And Todd's mother's so glad to hear him, and they, you know, all of that. And he said, "I'm sorry, I can't tell you where I am." And his mother said, "I know where you are. You're in Camp MylesStandish in Taunton, Massachusetts." I don't think even he knew that. and he said to her, "This is top secret. How do you know that?" And he said, "Well, because Reverend so-and-so, the minister from 2 towns over, saw you this afternoon, and he called me and told me." That sort of thing. This is a whole other great story, you know. A bunch of them from Mississippi get on a train, and when they get on the train, their families are there to see them off. When these trains traveled from and to Camp MylesStandish, they had the shades pulled. They didn't want people to see the patches on their uniforms were covered because you know that's important information. They didn't want anything, so they used to pull the shades. Well, they got on the train, and their families are there saying goodbye to them. This is Mississippi. Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. Pull the shades. The train is supposed to go 100 miles and take on water. The trains needed water in those days. They got 100 miles away, and one of these guys decides to be brave and put the shade up and see where he is. And when he put the shade up, the same people who had said goodbye were on the platform saying hello because they had followed the train all the way up. One more. Security is supposed to be top secret. You know, they got these passes. They had to be back if they were going to Boston, they had to be back in the camp by midnight. Supposed to be terrible if you weren't on time. Oh, it's terrible. Don't be late. Don't be late. In fact, nothing happened to you, but you had to be there. I talked to a guy. This is years ago, Tauntonian, whose job they had free bus service from Taunton Green to the camp, and the bus service would start at 6 o'clock in the morning and it would end at midnight. And this guy told me that the first run of the morning would be 6 o'clock in the morning, and he would meet all of these guys on his bus who had been late. They're 6 hours late. Half of them are drunk. The rest of them are raising all kinds of hell. And he would say to them, this bus is going to make 3 stops. Listen, this bus is going to make 3 stops. One is going to be the main gate on Bay Street. The second is going to be the gate on Bassett Street. And the third is going to be at the hole in the fence at the end of Bassett Street. And that's where everybody got off. I'll say that if the people, they were 2 companies of military police in Taunton. And Friday and Saturday nights were particularly lively in Taunton. Also, for all sorts of reasons. There would be a brisk business in the Taunton jail on Friday and Saturday nights. But it's interesting to me, it's a different time, remember. The people of Taunton were very, very, very tolerant of what happened then, because they knew where these guys were going. So that if I were a storekeeper in Taunton and some soldier ended up going through my plate glass window, which happened frequently, they would let that go. Minor offenses, the drunkenness. I should also say that following the United States Army to Camp MylesStandish was another army of prostitutes and grifters who followed the Army as well, and always have throughout history. The people of Taunton were very forgiving in that sense. The only thing they didn't like, and this was troublesome sometimes, if a soldier committed a serious crime, which occasionally happened, there were a couple of rapes, a couple of serious assaults and batteries. What would happen is that soldier would be arrested and he would be brought to the Taunton jail. And the MPs would pick him up and they would take him back to the camp where he would be subject to military discipline. But the people in Taunton would never find out what happened to him. They would never find out whether he had been punished severely or not at all or whatever. All of these guys went over. And people of Taunton didn't like that. They were all in favor of treating these guys respectfully and leniently, but they wanted to know that there was some type of justice going on. Anyway, this is either coming or going. Understand, okay? The cafeteria, it's not a cafeteria, it's a mess hall at Camp MylesStandish, made 40 to 50,000 sandwiches a day. Every soldier who was leaving there, and everybody, they left every day, got a box lunch. Box lunch. Every soldier who was arriving on a train got a box lunch. I saw a statistic, and I wrote it down, and I'll keep it. I'll find it someplace. But the number of eggs that they cooked in the space of a day was staggering. This was a major operation. I'm trying to keep up with my slides. This was taken from a water tower. Those are the barracks. I'll tell you more about the barracks at the end when we talk about demobilization. But that's where most of the soldiers stayed. There was one stove in there, a wood stove or a coal stove that they used. But they weren't in there very, very long. This is one of the workshops. This was a workshop where they would look at the chassis of trucks and Jeeps and also the undercarriage of the big guns. And if they were needing repair or replacement, they would do that there. The camp had a complement. That is a group of soldiers who were there permanently. There were 2,300 of them. And they were the guards, they were the mechanics, the cooks, etc. 2,300 of them. I'll tell you now, and I'll mention it again in a minute, I'll show you a picture of it. Camp MylesStandish, like the United States Army, was segregated. There were about 250 to 300 black soldiers there. They lived apart, they ate apart, they worked apart, they were segregated. And I'll tell you about one notable exception in a minute. This is interesting. You can see the bleachers there. These bleachers are set up on the Can you see? Am I in the way? These bleachers are set up on the shore of Watson Pond. When you talk to these guys when they came back after the war, one of the outstanding and lasting memories was they would be made to simulate abandoning ship at the Watson's Pond. There was a simulated ship built. This is on Watson's Pond, and these guys, many of whom who had never seen the ocean, would be instructed and drilled in how to abandon ship. You and me, that doesn't look particularly dangerous to us, but they were terrified of it. Long enough so that years after the war, 50 years after the war, they would still recount that as the most memorable part of their stay there. This poor guy, he's apparently been saved. He's going to go to Boston that night, and he's going to forget about all this. Many of the civilians who worked there were telephone operators. They were most of them Taunton girls. There were 750 civilian employees at MylesStandish. That's a lot, huh? Almost all of them came within a 30-mile radius of the camp. They had a hassle when the camp first opened, because in those days, Route 140, as we know it, the highway wasn't there. It was Old County Street, you know where I am. And some of those civilians used Old County Street as a race course to and from work. And all sorts of threats and the rest of it were passed their way to slow down. But let me also tell you, there were absolutely no cameras allowed in Camp MylesStandish, except the 500 photographs of these beautiful girls that were taken by soldiers whenever they had the opportunity. There's another one. This is, I'll show you. That's one of the service clubs. That's a saloon hall. There were 7 of them in the camp. And if you couldn't go to Boston or Providence or Taunton, if your luck was really bad, you went there. This was one of the officers' clubs. This is a movie theater. You may remember, if you're not from Taunton, you might not, but that building lasted into the 1970s. Lots of these buildings from the camp, the bigger ones, remained, and they were taken over by the state of Massachusetts. They were turned into warehouses mostly, and they were torched one by one by high school kids on, on Friday nights. This is the amphitheater. You have 38,000 people. Some of the most famous entertainers in the world played at MylesStandish. Also, they had all sorts of sports there. Boston Red Sox played at MylesStandish twice, 1943 and 1944. They played the team from Camp MylesStandish. I'm going to talk more about the team in a minute. This is the stockade. It did a brisk business, particularly on weekends. But again, almost all of the infractions related to alcohol, which led to fights, the whole thing. Prostitution was also a serious issue, but prostitutes who were arrested didn't come here. They went to the Taunton jail. And very little happened to them, too. There's a great story, a little tiny piece in the Taunton Gazette, 1944. Right downtown in Taunton is Union Street, which is off Main Street. And this lieutenant from the Army, in the United States Army, who was arrested on Union Street for being with a prostitute, was taken out, and as he walked by the reporter who was taking the story down, the guy said, "Look at me. I'm about to give my life, and you guys are pulling this on me." They were taking him to the jail. Nothing happened to him for certain. But that's where you would have gone.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Where was the police station?
Police station in Taunton. Police station in Taunton was right off the green. It was on Court Street. You know the Superior Courthouse in
Yes,
town?
I mean, for years, it used to be in the basement of the National Guard Army.
Right. That was not the case in World War II. There was a police station in Taunton, which was right on Court Street. If you know where I am, if I stand at the post office in Taunton, right next to the post office on the right, there's a little street that goes down to the Gazette building. Over on that corner, there's now the Crocker building, which is insurance and so forth. The police station was about 2 doors down there. It was built in 1909 and it was torn down in the 1970s. And then the cops went to the armory. So right in there. Right across the street from the courthouse. So as I said, these guys, the camp is segregated. This is the chaplain, who was a captain. They had their own church services. They used the regular church, but they had a segregated hour. They also used the same lunch mess hall, but they had segregated times and so forth. And let me tell you about one exception. The United States Army was entirely segregated and would be until 1948. This camp, 2,300 soldiers there all the time. They had their own basketball team. They had their own baseball team. Joe Louis fought exhibitions there against soldiers. So there were some great athletes there. Well, they had a baseball team at Camp MylesStandish, and it was segregated. It was white. They also had a black team, which played on the other side of the camp. Well, when they did tryouts in 1943 for the team, a black guy shows up. And they explained to him, he knows already, okay? But they explained to him that this is a segregated camp and he needs to go play on the black team. And he asked them if he could just try out, and they said, well, how old are you? And I think he said he was like 34 or something like that. And they said to him, what's your name? And he said, my name is Tommy Dukes. None of them had ever heard of him. Tommy Dukes had been the catcher for Satchel Paige in the Negro Leagues. Wow. He had been a Negro League star for 15 years before the war. I don't know how it happened, but they said, oh, fine. Get out in the field and we'll see what you can do. He was a catcher. He became the star of that league. He integrated the MylesStandish baseball team single-handedly. This is him right now. That's what he looked like. And he's 37 years old when this picture was taken. They played the Boston Red Sox at Hopewell Park in town. On the Red Sox team, there were a couple of Hall of Famers, future Hall of Famers. Bobby Dorr, if you're a baseball fan. Al Simmons. Joe Cronin was manager of that team. When they played the Red Sox, the night that they played the Red Sox, he hit the longest home run of the night. Now, this is interesting. I gave this talk, I don't know, a couple of months ago at the Bridgewater Public Library. And it was filmed. About a month later, I got a call from a guy who was the son of the coach of the MylesStandish baseball team, who had seen this film someplace on cable TV. The coach's name was Bo Bohannon, and his son, young Bohannon, lives in Florida. And he told me that his father, in the 1950s, which is 10 years after the war, his father told him that the ball that Dukes hit that night was still in the air someplace. That's how much he hit it. So he's a very interesting guy. He died in 1981 as an old man. But he integrated that team. And they were only too glad to have him. So these guys are leaving. They're going to Boston. Here's what happened. You're there 3 to 5 days. You're ready to go. When you left, it depended on the availability of shipping from Boston overseas. These troop ships would arrive and leave all the time, and your departure depended on when one of them arrived. You would get on that train. You would go to Boston, the Boston Army base, which became the Boston Army base, and your train would go right inside a massive building. the tracks would go right inside. And when that train got in there, the door would close in back of the train. And the door in front of the train would open, and there's the gangplank. You're not going anywhere other than up that gangplank. And you would be on that ship, and you would be off. That's one of the troop ships. Okay, so let's talk about prisoners. That's a subject that always comes up. In 1943, thousands of prisoners, 51,000 in fact, prisoners, Italian soldiers, were taken in North Africa, and prisoners of war. And they are sent, many of them, to the United States. As they're coming across and as they're arriving, Italy surrenders. Not only does Italy surrender, Italy switches sides. So no longer are these Italians prisoners of war. They now achieve the status of co-belligerents. And when they arrive, they are given the opportunity to volunteer for what they call Italian service units. More than 90% of these guys volunteered for that. So they became basically laborers. And they were assigned at first to camps on the interior of the continent. And eventually they migrated to the coasts. There were about 4,000 of them at Camp MylesStandish. The people in Taunton simply continued to call them prisoners of war. They weren't. They lived under military discipline at Camp MylesStandish, just like the soldiers did. They didn't wear prisoner uniforms, they wore work clothes. And they were assigned to different tasks in the camp. I saw an account, one of these guys was many of these Italians, by the way, were very gifted stone makers, stone workers. If you look, for example, at the Taunton Superior Courthouse, that stone was fashioned by Italians back in the 1890s. This guy was saying that he was captured, he was a private, and he was sent to Camp MylesStandish, where there was all kinds of construction going on. And they took this talented, gifted stonemaker, and they put him in the mess hall so he could crack eggs for the year that he was there. Meanwhile, they take some cook and put him out there laying bricks. That's just the way it was. But they worked in the camp. Very, very interesting to me, because when we talk about World War, we romanticize World War II. We really do. I mean, all of the movies on made of World War II are basically romanticized versions, because we know what happened. We knew we were the good guys and we won. But there were parts of the war and parts of that experience which were less well known and which weren't so attractive. One of them was there were lots of people in Taunton and everywhere else who were not particularly welcoming to these people who came over as prisoners, particularly in the short run, the Italians. Because these people, these Italians, lived in the barracks. They were fed very well. They were given clean clothes. They could take passes. They could get passes to leave the barracks, to leave the camp. In the beginning, it was only if you had a chaperone, but that faded. And what would happen is these guys were actually embraced and adopted by the Italian Americans who lived in Taunton. The Italian neighborhood in the Brickyard in Taunton, those people would take these guys to Mass on Sundays. They would have them come home for Sunday dinner, and they became part of the woodwork. There were lots of people who didn't like that one bit, to the point where the command in Boston issued an order to these army camps in Massachusetts. You make sure that these Italians, you make sure that they're working 8 to 10 hours a day. This is no holiday for them. We don't want the wrong impression to be given. You work those people. But it was still, a good experience for them. This guy, one guy, Italian, there's one of the stories that goes around is that these Italians became so attached to the families that they got girlfriends in the Italian families, and some of them stayed and got married to the girlfriends, and they lived happily ever after. That's not true. Nobody stayed. because this was part of the Geneva Convention, and the Geneva Convention said, if you are if you have a prisoner, or you have somebody who's brought over under the rules of warfare, he's got to go back. He can't stay. So what happened was, many of these girls went back with them. They would be married in Italy, and they would come back to the United States, and it would be easier for these guys to be, assimilated and to become citizens. And that happened quite frequently. That was a frequent thing. They worked, sometimes you would see, but you would see them around. The only thing left from Camp MylesStandish, if you were to look for an artifact of Camp MylesStandish, the only thing that you would see today is this. It's a grotto, which is a religious grotto. There's a religious statue in that, in back of that frosted glass there. That was made by the Italian co-belligerents, prisoners in Camp MylesStandish. You can still see it. It was restored in 1983. The man that you see in the picture there, his last name was Varilla. He lived in Mansfield. He was one of those Italians who married a local girl and lived for lived the remainder of his life here. That's the only thing you can see. But it's easy to see. It's right inside the Taunton MylesStandish Industrial Park, and it's right next to the. I think it's the Lions Club now in Taunton.
Excuse me.
Yeah, sure.
One quick question.
Sure.
Beyond that grotto,
Yep.
I remember exploring there several years ago.
Yep.
It looks like there's an amphitheater.
Yeah, the amphitheater was right in back of that.
Did they dig that out?
Yes. First of all, nothing happened to it for a year, so it deteriorated on its own.
Oh.
But you can still see where the land falls.
But that was part of the
Yeah,
work they
it
did?
was. Yeah, it was.
Okay.
All of a sudden, a tiny piece appears in the Taunton Daily Gazette in May 10th, 1945. Now that's 2 days after Germany surrenders. And this tells people in Taunton that there will be German prisoners of war also arriving at Camp MylesStandish. That is an entirely different story. There were 3,000 that came. If you lived in Taunton or anywhere, you would very, very rarely see these guys because they were prisoners and they were kept under the closest guard possible. They were kept on the camp. The only exception was by 1945 there was a tremendous labor shortage all across the United States. These men were all overseas. If you're familiar with Taunton, one of the most obnoxious industries in Taunton history was the Guylick Tannery, which was down in the Ware section of Taunton. Now that existed well into my childhood, and I can still to this day, as I'm standing here, smell that place.
After that, my grandmother worked there.
It was terrible. They dumped, we did a history of the river, they dumped stuff in the river, thousands of tons of it, gallons of it, they dumped in that river that turned the river yellow and red and everything else. It was awful. They couldn't find anybody to work there. So every day, 7 o'clock in the morning, an army truck with 35 German prisoners would come down from the camp, jeeps on both sides with machine guns and the whole thing, and go to the Guylick Tannery, and these guys would work in the Guylick Tannery for 10 hours a day. The Geneva Convention, I want to mention again the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention mandated that if you had prisoners of war and you put them to work, you had to pay them. These guys, as well as the Italians, were paid 80 cents a day. They were not paid in money, they were paid in script to the canteens on the camp. They didn't want them to have money. But that's the only way that you would have seen a German prisoner. The Italians wore work clothes. They looked like carpenters and so forth. The Germans did not. They had a black shirt, black pants, black shoes with a white P painted on both sides of it. Nobody ever saw them. Now, I want to come to this. There was a guy in Taunton who died much too young, about in 2014. His name was Charlie Crowley. Does anybody know Charlie? You do. Yeah, absolutely. Charlie was a wonderful person who was totally immersed in Taunton history. Charlie and I got a call in about 1993 from an Attleboro reporter in a newspaper who said that there was a former German prisoner who had been at MylesStandish who was coming back to Taunton to visit and to see if he could remember anything from Camp MylesStandish, and wanted to know if Charlie and I would take him to the camp and take him around, which we did. His name was Walter Schertl. That's Walter. This isn't the clearest picture in the world, but you get the idea. Walter Schertl was about 17 years old, and he was a paratrooper in the German army. He never jumped, but he was a paratrooper. He was captured in Belgium at the end of 1944, and the Belgians were in the process of beating him to death when an American patrol came along and saved his life. And he became a prisoner of war for the United States. He was sent from Belgium to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and then to Camp MylesStandish, where he worked in the mess hall. So we took him around. He remembered absolutely nothing, because there was nothing to, first of all, he didn't know where he was, right? When he was a prisoner. I asked him, the German and the English meshed occasionally. I asked him what he thought of Taunton, and he said, I had no idea where we were. I said, where did you think you were, Boston? He said, no, I don't know. I didn't know where we were. And I said to him, did you ever think about escaping? And he laughed. He said, are you kidding? I don't know where I am, so I don't know where I'm going. I don't speak English. I've got this ridiculous uniform on. I've never eaten as well in my life. No, I didn't think about going anywhere. He said, in fact, that when he was repatriated, he went back to Germany. He wore the same shoes for 3 years. They were the best shoes he ever had. I said to him, how were you treated? And he said, we were treated okay. He said there was one guard that he remembered who would share food with him. He worked in the mess hall, but he was strictly controlled. One guard would share food with him. Another guard, though, one of the things that they did, this was at the end of the war, they had recently come across the concentration camps at Auschwitz and Dachau and places like that. And he said they put up big photographs of the Jews who had been killed and were had died in these camps. And they wanted these Germans to see them. And he said that they had to take classes at night. At night they studied the American government and United States history. And the reason for that was because the Americans knew that these guys were going to go back to Germany, and they wanted people who were familiar with democracy and some type of representative government to be back there. But he was interesting. He was interesting. He said one of the guards called him over one time and said, come over here. He said he walked over, and the guard said to him, the war's over, but you're never going home. You Germans, you're going to be placed on ships, and you're going to go back to Europe, and you're going to rebuild the cities that Hitler destroyed. That's tough for a 17 or 18-year-old kid. But he was interesting to talk to. We took him. He didn't see anything, but they were still in those days, in the 90s. This was one of the guard towers that was still in the woods there. And he didn't recognize it, but he knew what it was, and had his picture taken in front of it. That's closer. That's the tower.
About what year was this?
This is about 1993. Okay, so war ends. Don't need this camp anymore. 1,500 buildings. You can have one. All you have to do is pay $1 and get it out of there. There's the rub, right? But there are still buildings in Taunton that you see that were barracks buildings for the camp. I don't know how familiar you are with Taunton, but there's a nursery school in Taunton called Brick House School. If you look at Brick House School, that's one of those. There are still several of them around. Well, I'm sure I've forgotten some of the stuff that I want to tell you, but I'll leave this with. No, I'm not going to leave you with this. I'll tell you the same. Anybody feels like they want to leave, just jiggle your keys and I'll get them.
That clock is not correct. We never said it.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, I'm rolling anyway. So, So they got this 1,620 acres. What are they going to do with it? As a Tauntonian, I'm going to tell you this story, and I have to say that I'm a little bit embarrassed by it, but I've told this so many times that whatever. In 1946, the United States and the world was looking for a place to put the headquarters of the United Nations. And we applied. We said, what better place to put the United Nations headquarters than Camp MylesStandish, 1,620 acres. And we actually, in fact, put an application in. And we were to this day convinced that it was fixed, that it was a bag job for New York City. Because, hey, who goes to New York when you can come to town? Finally. These guys are recently repatriated American prisoners of war. And they have just gotten off the train at Camp MylesStandish. Because here's the thing, more than 1.5 million soldiers in World War II went through the camp on the way over and came back through the camp on the way back. And these guys are on the way back. Let me say to you, they look pretty good, don't they? And that's because they've been fattened up when they arrived. They were sent to different camps immediately to make them look like they had, like they were okay. Many of them were not okay. But they were then sent to Camp MylesStandish. And what would happen then is they would be sent from Camp MylesStandish to a base near their homes in the United States for discharge. Well, these guys have just arrived. There they are on the train coming back. And I love this guy, and I'm going to leave it with him. I have seen this picture. I've been doing research on Taunton and World War II 50 years. And I saw his picture literally 1,000 times in the Taunton Daily Gazette. He's kind of a cocky looking guy, isn't he? And he's on the way. He's on the way, he's coming back. He's on the train from Boston to Taunton to Camp MylesStandish. And I said to myself, after years and years and years, I wonder who that guy is. I found out that his name was Robert Kelso, Kelso, from Texas. So I said to myself, he's probably, he's World War II. So I'm looking around, I think, well, man, I wonder if he's still alive. Some of these guys, they're almost 100 years old now, but I wonder if he's alive. So I started looking. Kelso. And all of a sudden, now, thanks to the internet, you can call up newspapers all over the United States. And I started to do that, and I kept seeing this picture. Come to find out, in 1944, Robert Kelso from Texas, San Antonio, I think, ran into the Army recruiting office in San Antonio in a celebratory mood and wanted to enlist in the Army. And he said to them that he felt extremely lucky because this was his 18th birthday and the war was still going on. And he had been afraid that the war would end before he could get a piece of it. That would have been the great tragedy of his life. Because he, as a little boy even, he had waited and hoped to be in the Army for this war. And here he is now, eligible. Well, they got plenty of war left for Robert Kelso. They signed him up. He goes through basic training, and he goes in a armored anti-aircraft unit. And they go to Germany, and they fight like crazy. And he becomes one of the very few American soldiers in World War II in the European theater to actually go hand-to-hand combat with Germans. He fights it out with a bayonet with a bunch of Germans who are on the verge of retreat, but they can't get out, so they fight it with the Americans. And he goes after them, and they go after him, and he gets wounded badly in the leg. They send him to the hospital, and he spends the last 6 weeks of the war in the hospital. In the course of that, trying to decide whether he's going to need to go to a military hospital in the United States or whatever, but they start looking into him. And all of a sudden, that becomes extremely embarrassing. Because Robert Kelso, when he walked into the Army recruiters that day, was 14 years old. He was not 18, he was 14. So now the Army has a hot potato in their hands. They don't know what to do with. That's why he's in every newspaper. He gets to MylesStandish. They don't want anything to do with him. They process him as fast as they can, and they ship him out for Texas. So I'm wondering, what happened to this guy? So I start digging, and I can't find anything. This kid disappears off the face of the earth. So I keep digging. It goes now several months, maybe a year. And I still continue to dig. Well, here's what happened to him. He got back in the States. He's a star. He decides he's going to go to college. And they're all following him. You know, newspapers are following him. He goes to Texas. He enrolls in a college. And then all of a sudden the world goes on and people lose track of him. As soon as they lose track of him, he drops out of college. And he decides he's going to go see his sister in California. So he went to see his sister in California for about 5 minutes, and then he enlisted in the Army. He's 15 now. This is the age before computers. So, listen, the Army. He is assigned to an airborne division. Paratrooper. He loves it. Gets his jump wings, gets the whole thing. They send him to Germany in the Army of Occupation. And he's great. Making jumps, all of that. He jumps out of a plane and sprained his leg or something. And goes to the hospital. Kelso's got to realize that he can't go to the hospital. He goes near the hospital, go to the hospital, and they find out who it is. And he comes back, again, big story. He comes back again. So they discharge him. And the last thing he says as he's walking out of the discharge place was, "I'll be back." So I'm wondering what happened to him. You know, what happened to this guy? There's a story here, I want that story. So I keep digging, and I come across this. This is the website for the 508th Paratroop Infantry Regiment. And this tells me that he died in 1956, which does not surprise me, right? Doesn't surprise me a bit. But I say to myself, well, what did he do? What can we find out? So I keep digging, and this is many weeks, months even. And finally I come across a listing for a foundation, charitable foundation in San Antonio. I think I would have to look again, but I believe it's the Betty Kelso Memorial Foundation. I'm thinking to myself, well, he would have been old enough at the time to have established a family with children. Maybe they're his kids. So I'm looking, and finally I come across a phone number for them. I call up. That's what you do when you're a history kid. You're nosy. I call up. A young lady answers the phone in San Antonio. And I told her who I was. I said that I had read about Robert Kelso's World War II experience, and I'm wondering if there was someone in that area, in that foundation, who could tell me about him. And she said, well, there's nobody here right now who can do that. I think she said there's someone, they're in Dallas or someplace. She said, but they'll be back on next Thursday if you want to come, if you want to try again. So I debated that, but I said, oh, what the heck, you know? So late in the afternoon on this particular day, I called that number again, and the same girl answered. I told her who I was again, and she said, oh, okay, there's somebody here can help you. And a man came on the phone and said, is this Bill Hanna? And I said, yeah. And he said, I'm Robert Kelso. He was alive. 88 years old.
Wow.
I said to him, I said to him, I just saw your gravestone. 508 Paratroop Infantry Regiment. And he said, well, call him up and tell him I don't need it yet. We had a great, he's, to this day, you know, last I knew, and I don't know whatever happened, how that happened, but he's very much alive. And we had a couple of really wonderful conversations. I was 88 years old. I said to him, you know, you're a kid when you get over there. By the time you get over there, you ever think that you could get killed? We went hand to hand, for God's sake. And he said, yeah. He said, you know, I got over there a while, and I was thinking, you could get hurt here. But he said, you know, when you're young, you think you're invincible. Nothing can happen to you when you're young. He said, so I just didn't think much about that. I said to him, I'm going to write this up, right? I'm going to write a story about this. I said, is there anything, I have a friend who's way into World War II, and that unit that he was with is fairly obscure. It was quite small. Many of these units put together the little histories at the end that they gave to the veterans and so forth. And as it turned out, my friend had one of those, and I got it and I sent it to Kelso. And I talked to him. I said to him, you know, in fact, I think he called me. And he said, you know, I was looking through, he had it day by day. And you could see in there where it said that he had been wounded on a particular day. He said, I'll tell you, I'm really, really, really sad that I missed the last 6 weeks of the war, because that was very interesting. So I said to him, what'd you do? You know, what did you do after the war? And he said, I want to go to college. But he didn't have a high school diploma. He befriended, I believe, a nun in maybe New Orleans, and she prepared him for the GED. And he took the GED, and he passed, and he was admitted to a college. But the only way he could get through the college was the ROTC. So he joined the ROTC. And after he graduated, he did 2 tours in Vietnam. Wow. I said to him, well, I'm going to write this story. Is there anything you want me to say about it? He said, yeah. He said, tell them that I made something of my life. That Betty Kelso Foundation, if her name was Betty, was his wife. Who had, this is Kelso. In the middle, larger than life. His wife is the lady who's with him. She had since died after we started talking, but they are in France. Oh my goodness. They are in France, and they are receiving a medal from the French government in recognition of his World War II service. So that was, I don't know, 4 or 5 or 6 years ago. 4 years ago. And people always say to me, well, did you write the story? I want to read the story. I didn't write the story. And I'm not going to write the story. There's just something about that doesn't sit with me. I mean, I picked him out of nowhere. He wasn't expecting me to call him. And I never did look, I have not looked to see if he's still alive. Because if I don't, for me, he still is alive. And I think that's the way that I will leave that. And that's the way that I will leave you. Anybody have any questions? Right.
Well, actually, too, the first thing I was thinking about throughout this was, of all the places around Boston for camp, how did they get to Taunton?
Taunton wasn't the only place. Camp Edwards down the Cape but Taunton was the main staging area. And it makes perfect sense if you look at a map, because Taunton was a railroad center that the tracks were already coming into. Taunton, beginning in the middle of the 19th century, was a railroad center. Nobody went any place of importance on the train without going through Taunton. So they didn't have to construct any more than 10 miles of that. That's the first question. How about the second?
This about Kelso. He was born in 26.
No, that's wrong.
Oh,
I forget what year he was born. That's wrong. That obviously isn't even the same guy. I don't know. Whoever that is. No, anybody else? Questions?
Yeah, I got a question.
Go ahead.
I recently read a book, George McGovern,
Yeah,
and he came back from Italy on his Liberator,
right.
and the book ends with him landing at Camp MylesStandish.
Yeah, he didn't land in Camp MylesStandish. He landed in, what's the air base out there in?
Hanscom?
Hanscom. He landed at Hanscom and came to MylesStandish to be processed.
Okay.
Yeah. I want to say one thing. When I was invited, I looked up, somebody showed me a website, maybe for this organization, and there were some comments there, and one of the comments was that somebody's father had told him that the prisoners of war there at Camp MylesStandish were treated better than the American soldiers. That's a myth that goes out, which is not true. And that needs to be explained. If I take a look at the Germans were treated very, very, very well at Camp MylesStandish, very well. New clothes, good food, good barracks, the whole thing. And that was for two reasons. One, we had signed the Geneva Convention of how to treat prisoners. So that was the morally right thing to do. But second, we also wanted to give the Germans no excuse to mistreat American prisoners overseas. We were going to adhere to the letter and the spirit of the Geneva Convention 100%, so that we could at least do the most we could to protect the interests of our guys who were being held over there. But there were lots of them, people who had that idea that the Germans were being treated while we weren't. We love conspiracies in this country, you know, all of that. But that was one of them. And it was the same thing, you know, with the Italians. People objected to the fact that an Italian who was our enemy just very recently can go home and have a roast beef dinner on a Sunday afternoon while my brother or my son or my father was over losing his life in Europe, you know. That's more understandable. Nothing else?
I think that that's sort of relative though. I've talked to many guys over in Germany who were POWs.
Yeah.
And you start reflecting on, they grew up in a terrible depression,
The Germans, you mean?
the Germans
Yeah,
and everything.
yeah.
I talked about it, you ever think about escaping when they were over? Hell no.
No, No.
You know, they
No.
just said,
no.
are you kidding me?
Yeah.
I'm eating better than I am.
Yeah, the laws for Germany.
Better than the other guy, and that was a fact, actually.
Almost no German prisoner of war escaped in the United States. The last one who did turned himself in like 1985 as an old man. And he said he's thoroughly American by then. His kids are American and all of that. No, they weren't interested in going. And many of them, it's very interesting. We can go all night, and I don't want to do that. You don't want me to, and I don't want to. But the German prisoners of war were divided into two groups: the officers and the enlisted men. They had a real problem in some of the camps in the United States with the officers, because those guys were die-hard Nazis, and they put the pressure on fellow prisoners to be troublesome. And if they didn't, they would kill them or they would beat them up. But that was a huge issue. That was not an issue in Taunton, because those guys were mostly poor young privates who weren't all that enthralled with Nazism even in the beginning. They weren't any trouble, but there was a lot to worry about there. 350,000 German prisoners were brought across to the United States. All right, go ahead.
Kind of off the wall.
Yeah.
Years ago, there was a toy train museum in Philbrook, A&D
Yep.
toy train.
Yep.
Gentleman owned it was named Adolf,
Adolf.
and Adolf. And he supposedly had an Austrian prisoner of war. So, do you know anything about him?
I don't.
Just being in MylesStandish?
No, there were no Austrian soldiers.
No Austrian soldiers.
No, no.
Well, thank you, Bill.
Thank you.